Ni hao, and welcome to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. This week's Todd Talk is coming to you from Beijing, China, where I'm spending the next 7 days teaching students academic writing and vocabulary. The students that I'm working with are from China, but they speak English. And so I thought there would be a lot of cultural differences and a lot of changes in the classroom. But one thing I have found in my first 3 days is that it's just like classrooms are the same all over the world. And students need to be challenged, and you need to raise the rigor no matter what their language. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today: is how you can raise the rigor in your classroom. A good way to do that, and we talked about higher level questioning, is the idea of follow-up questions or probing questions. How a probing question works is you ask a lower level question, maybe a comprehension question or an understanding question or a recall question. And when that student gives you an answer, you ask a follow up question. And that follow up question is designed to take them to the next level of thinking. And it's designed to challenge them to think differently, or to think about something in another light, or to consider something that they hadn't considered. And these probing questions can do a really good job of challenging students to really think about things that they normally wouldn't think about. And it's going to challenge them. And that's how you can raise the rigors, by challenge their thinking. So what we'll be talking about today is how you can use probing questions or follow-up questions to raise the rigor in your own classroom. What is meant by probing questions, or what does it look like in your classroom? So some simple examples to simplify it is, if a student gives you a what, if you ask a what question and they give you a what response, follow that up with why. So if they say this happened, and then you say, well, why do you think that happened? Or why do you think that character did that? Or why did that occur? Follow it up with a why. The student is asked a when question, ask the follow-up question with how. So when I did this, I was like, well, how did you do that? And have them, explain how they did it. This is really important with kids in math, because kids will get correct answers but not know necessarily how, or know that there could have been a better way to do it. And so you want kids to be thinking. If who, then because. So if is this person, then why is that? Or why, then because why? So then a follow-up question there. If where, then what about this or that? So if they say, I went here, and you say, well, did you consider going here, or did you think about this place? But again, these questions are designed just to probe a little bit deeper. It's the Socratic method, where Socrates used to ask questions over and over and over until he arrived at a truth. And that's what a probing question is just digging a little bit deeper. You want to get through that surface level of what the student is doing and try to get to something a little more meaty. Written feedback on assessments can also ask. It doesn't have to be spoken follow-up questions. You can write follow-up questions on written assessments. So if a student, is writing an essay, and you say, "Well, did you think about this perspective?" That's a follow-up question where you're asking them to think about something and consider it. If students are doing a math problem and you're grading that, and you say, was there an alternative way to do this? Again, that's a follow-up question that's making them think about the math itself. So when you're first learning how to write, or how to speak higher level questions in your classroom, you can do what's called scripting. Scripting means, if you have a discussion, you script out 7 to 10 questions that you want to have answered. And you may get to all of them, you may not get to all of them. But the idea here is that you've kind of prepared these higher level questions ahead of time, and it's easier to prepare them ahead of time than it is to think of them on the spot. And so, although the better you get at it, the better you become at making them on the spot. But when you're writing these scripting questions, you want to ask yourself a few questions. So first off, are you asking an open or a closed question? So if you're asking a question that has a one-word answer, guess what you're going to get? A one-word answer. So you want to ask questions that are more open-ended. What type of response are you expecting from students? So you're asking this question, and what are you trying to get out of them? Is it phrased in a way that's going to get this out of them? So when you complain the kid didn't give a very good answer, well, the question is, did you ask a very good question? Do you have a good mix? So we talked about, when you're using higher level questions, it should be about 50-50. So when you're asking questions in class, even when a kid comes in and you're asking them how their day was, could you ask them in a different way? Like, what was the best thing that you did today? And then they're having to really think about that, because I know when I pick up my daughter from school, I'll say, "How was your day?" And she says, "Fine," every time. And no matter what, that's what she says. So I started asking different questions. I started saying, "What was the most amazing thing you learned today?" Or "What was something a teacher did that surprised you?" But I'm just asking those questions a little bit differently, so that it emotes more response from that. So what are you going to do if students answer differently than you expect? So sometimes students will answer something that seems totally off the wall. It's really important to use probing questions to explore that. So for instance, I once had a student, when I asked a question, "Is there ever a time 2 plus 2 does not equal 4?" And the student said, "Yes, Mr. Stanley, it's when it equals ballet." And if I had left it at that, I would not have had a clue as to why she answered that. I might have chalked it up to her just not knowing. But then she gave me her response. A follow-up question was, why ballet? And she said, "Because of tutu." And all of a sudden it made sense and it was clear to me. But again, you have to ask that follow-up question to kind of get to the motive of what they're doing, or to understand why they're doing it. You want to avoid having dead-end questions. These are questions that don't go anywhere. So you may have a discussion going and it's very rich and people are kind of responding to one another, and then you stop that and you ask a question that kind of just derails that whole discussion part. Because the beautiful part about discussion is not what you've planned to do, but what actually happens. So you can plan a discussion as much as you want, but the best discussions are usually take a life of their own, and you're not following the plan necessarily. Do you have enough questions to sustain a discussion? So if you're having a discussion with students, I always try to have more questions than I'm going to need, because that way, if I run out of questions, I'm not going to run out of questions, because I'll be able to use any of the questions that I have. So when you're asking questions of students in class orally, here are some things to consider. So the phrasing is, make sure that you ask the question in kid-friendly language. Our content standards are written in sometimes teachers can't understand them. So you have to make sure that when you're asking a question that it's at the student's level. So if they're a younger student, are you asking that appropriately for them? Or are you asking the question so that it's not using vocabulary that they're unfamiliar with? Adaptation. And again, this is adapting the question to fit the language and ability of the students. So it's kind of linked together. Sequencing is asking questions in a pattern order. So how I like to sequence questions is I start with some lower level questions, and then I scaffold up to a mid-level question, and then I scaffold up to a higher level question. And so it's the sequencing. So it may take me 3 or 4 questions to get what I want to get, but I've kind of been scaffolding it up so students can get there, so they're able to arrive at that higher level thinking. Balance is, as I've talked about, the 50-50 between higher level and lower level. Do you have a good balance of questions? Participation. So basically this is, how do students respond to your questions? Do you have them raise their hand and you call on them? Because what tends to happen there is the same 5 kids raise their hands. So are there different ways that you can get kids to participate? I had a no hands policy in my classroom where students were not allowed to raise their hand, and I just called on kids randomly. So everyone should expect to answer questions. And this was just the culture that we created. So it wasn't done to embarrass anyone or to try to catch anyone. It just was the culture that we had established. But trying to train kids not to raise their hand is very difficult. Probing, which we've been talking about. So these are questions that encourage students to clarify, to expand, to support what they're saying, to justify it. So these probing questions are just trying to arrive at a greater truth than what has been presented. This is one I think that's probably the one I see used the least and should be used the most, which is wait time. So when you ask a question of your class, how soon are you expecting a response? Because typically what happens is you ask a question, students raise their hands, and you call on someone. But keep in mind that that's an impulsive answer, their first thing that pops into their mind. What if instead you said, I want you to think about this for a minute. No one raised their hand for a minute. And at the end of a minute, I will take volunteers. And During that time, students are thinking about their possible answers, and they're thinking, oh, the first thing that popped in my head was this, but maybe that's not as good as answer as this. And so giving kids wait time gives you deeper responses. It also lets kids who process more slowly than others a chance to take part. Take part in the discussion. There are kids that have wonderful things to share, but because our classrooms are so fast paced and quick, they never get a chance to get a word in edgewise. So this will slow it down a little bit and allow them to do that. And then obviously student questions themselves. So if you get good at asking high level questions, kids just naturally start asking them themselves and of one another. So that's where you want to get to. So you want to ask students thought-provoking questions, asking them to reflect upon something before responding. That is a good way to kind of stir up the thinking of the student. You can always reverse the order. So instead of asking the question, ask the answer. Kind of jeopardy it. But the interesting thing is there's all sorts of possibilities. So if I say 27, what is the question? And there's lots of different questions that could equal 27. One of my favorites to use was the what if, especially being a history teacher. What if this had happened instead of that? So what if the British had won the American Revolution? How would things have been different? Or what if Hitler had been able to defeat the Russians on his East Coast? What would that have done for World War II? So lots of really interesting questions that you can ask. What if Martin Luther King Jr. had never been around? Would the Civil Rights Movement have been what it was? So there's lots of what if questions you can ask, and there's no definitive answer. This is very open-ended and asking kids to really think about this. So like I said before, you want to get students in the habit of writing questions themselves. So it may take a little bit of training to help them to recognize what higher level questions look like or what they are. But with a little bit of training here or there, you can get students to ask those questions of themselves. So the role of the teacher in this process is different than your traditional classroom. So as you can see from this visual, the traditional classroom usually has the sage from the stage. This means that the instructor is in front of the classroom and they are doling out instruction or information. We've moved over to more of a student-centered classroom where we guide on the side, and that's becoming very popular right now with project-based learning and things and more authentic learning strategies. And in this case, the teacher's kind of off to the side, just observing. For the probing questions, the role to take is kind of the in-between, what is called the meddler in the middle, which is if you have students working on a project in groups, your role as the teacher is to go around to those groups and ask thought-provoking, probing questions to try to get them thinking about something in a different way. So you're engaging that critical thinking, you're engaging that adaptation, you're engaging that creativity. You're really getting kids to think 21st century skills. And so being this meddler in the middle is really important. What does a meddler do? So again, you're not delivering packages like a sage from the stage. You're basically helping just kind of, enhance the learning. So it's more robust. It's going deeper. You're active in the student learning network. So what that means is you're going around and having conversations with students in groups and asking how things are going and following that up by asking them how it could go better or what they could be doing. Lots of things there. Being a meddler in the middle allows students to fail without shame. So you may ask a question they don't know the answer to, and that's perfectly okay. Those questions are not designed for right or wrong. The questions are designed to have them thinking. So if you can ask questions that allow them to do that, then you're better off. I think it really models and exemplifies creative learning because students are seeing that curiosity is rewarded and that they should be curious themselves about what it is that they're doing. And being the meddler in the middle allows you to go in and be curious and ask questions, and they see that demonstrated for themselves, and hopefully they'll take that on themselves. As I leave you from the Far East, one thing I want you to remember is by asking those probing questions, you are going to be encouraging students to think. And that is the most important thing that you can be doing in your classroom. That is how you raise the rigor, by encouraging them to think. And that's what probing does. And so the better you get at probing students with questions, the better responses you're going to be and the better that their learning is going to be as a result.